Welcome back to the Chara Project. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Heather.
We are studying the book of Jonah. And if you want to do a deep dive into Jonah, this is the place for you. We're actually picking back up this week in chapter 2. And if you want to study Jonah in greater detail, greater depth, download our Studying Jonah Bible study. You can find that on our website, thecharaproject.com. And in that Bible study, you're going to see that we use the Chara Bible Study Guide. We use questions in here, and we walk you through chapter by chapter to get a better in-depth study of this book. And if you haven't already checked out, you can go check out episode 93. It is an overview of the book of Jonah as a whole, kind of give you an overview before you dive in deep. But again, today we're going to dive into chapter 2 of Jonah.
Right, but before we dive into chapter 2, for those of you that just need a quick recap, place us in the story, Heather. Where are we? In Jonah 1, God asked Jonah to go to Nineveh and to give them a message, and Jonah didn't like it so much. So he fled. He got on a ship, and he ends up heading in the opposite direction. And while on the ship, God sends this great storm, and it in turn gets Jonah thrown overboard. And when he is sent overboard, the sea becomes calm, but what happens to Jonah? We end chapter 1 of Jonah trying to understand what happens to him, and we see that the Lord provides a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah ends up in the belly of a fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Chapter 1 ends there, and we know the story has not ended quite yet, but this is exactly where Jonah 2 picks up. We get this close-up look at Jonah as he starts to cry out to God in a plea, in a very poetic nature. The entire chapter of Jonah, chapter 2, is specifically a prayer to God and a conversation that Jonah wants to relate to God. And so typically, whenever we start reading any passage, we not only want to read the full thing in its entirety. We aren't going to do that today, but we would encourage you to go and read Jonah chapter 2. And then one of our most favorite questions in our Chara Bible Study Guide is to ask the question, what observations and questions do we have from the text? And what are we observing all on our own without having done any Bible study up until this point? And I have to say, when you first dive into chapter 2 of Jonah, there's a couple things that just are quite interesting that I observed. Number one is the fact that we see Jonah finally praying to God. To this point in chapter 1, he is avoiding God with everything in him, and yet this is the moment when we see him turn his posture toward God and actually start to pray. And that is one observation that's so fascinating. But it's also what causes him to finally get to the place of wanting to pray and reach out to God. We see it in chapter 2, right at the beginning, where he says, well, in my distress and from the depths of my grave, he talks about my life was ebbing away. We see that it's in the storm, it's in this chaos and in this troubled time that is causing Jonah to finally get to a rock bottom and be in a place where he's ready to talk to God and actually face God for the first time in our story. And so while there's a lot of things we can observe, these are the first 2 things that I think right out of the gate kind of help push off our conversation around Jonah chapter 2, just to kind of understand where Jonah is at in this moment, sitting in the darkness of the belly of the whale, or a fish, whatever. It's not technically a whale, but I think we all think of that just because that's our childhood thought process.
Right, and that would be a very big fish.
It would be. I think so. That'd be the one that could have fit a human.
I love that you started, Heather, with that question, really, what observations or questions do you have when you read this, especially because chapter 2 is a little bit of a shift in narrative, in literary style, right? The first chapter was really more narrative about here's what's going on, and then this is more of a prayer of Jonah crying out in prayer for help, right, as he's sinking in the depths of the water. But it also later on is this prayer of thanksgiving. So when you get into more of a poetic literary style, you kind of do want to read the whole thing and ask that question, okay, before I get into verse by verse, what am I seeing at overall?
Right.
So
where's that theme?
Yeah.
In the big picture, I want to understand and make some observations myself.
Yeah. So great question to get us started here. And kind of on that note, I'm going to read the first 2 verses here in chapter 2, and because we begin to see some figurative language, and I want to talk
Speaking
about
of poetic language, right?
Yeah. So chapter 2, verse 1, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish. I called to the Lord in my distress, and he answered me. I cried out for help from deep inside Sheol. You heard my voice. Okay, so right there in verse 2, I said, from deep inside Sheol, that I cried out for help. Where's Sheol? What is that? And if you are wondering, one of the first things that we would tend to do here is check out different Bible translations. So I'm reading out of my CSB, my Christian Standard Bible, and I'm asking myself, okay, what does that mean? Where is Sheol? What are we talking about? So I looked that up in a couple different translations, and the ESV says something very, very similar. It says the belly of Sheol, but the NIV says something different, doesn't it? And Heather usually is reading out the NIV, but that says the realm of the dead.
Yeah.
And that's how that translates that. The KJV says the belly of hell. And the New Living Translation I thought was pretty helpful too, the land of the dead. Okay, so these different translations are trying to help us understand really where Jonah was at as he's crying out to God. Where was his frame of reference? Where was he spiritually and physically and mentally, right? Well, he's expressing a fear of death while he's inside the belly of the fish, or while he's in Sheol. He's expressing this great fear of death, that he's dying, which in this Sheol, this belly of the fish, was metaphorically like a tomb.
Yeah.
You know, that he was in this watery grave or this tomb for several days, and this is where we see Jonah crying out. So as you read Jonah chapter 2, do be looking for some figurative language here.
Absolutely.
And trying to understand what is he trying to communicate by saying these things.
Yeah, and those Bible translations also really help if you get to a spot where you're like, well, that doesn't really help me understand what it really means. All Bible translations are doing is taking the original Greek and Hebrew, and they're trying to help figure out what would be the right one-for-one word. And because there always isn't a one-for-one word, Sheol's a great example. There's not a one-for-one word that we could potentially grasp what it really is talking about. So you can get a really good word picture by looking at a lot of different translations. That's fantastic, Sarah.
All right. So this also reminds me of when we were talking about when does Jonah cry out? And you mentioned this, right? When does Jonah finally cry out to God for help? Because this is a big shift from chapter 1. Yeah. Chapter 1, as you said, Jonah is running away from God. Chapter 2, Jonah finally cries out to God. But when is it that he does this, right? It's as he's finally in fear of that he's dying. It's in the depths of the ocean, you know, and all this figurative language describing the spot where he's at. And it reminds me of the prodigal son, the parable of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15.
Yeah.
When you look at the story of the younger brother, right? When is it that he finally turns and remembers the goodness of his father, right? The younger son, he asks his father for his inheritance early, which in that day was really a slap in the face.
Right.
You did
Truly.
not do that, right? And then he runs off to a distant country and he wastes all of it in just reckless living. After that, after he's wasted all of his money, there is a huge famine and he's starving and he's got nothing. And so what does he do? He goes and he is eating, he longs to eat the leftover food that was fed to the pigs. And it's at that moment when he truly has hit bottom, when he has wasted everything and he's got nowhere to turn, that he remembers God's goodness, the goodness of his father representing God in this parable. And he turns back and he goes and returns to the father. And boy, I can't tell you how much I wish that weren't always the case for us, that it didn't take for me to reach the depths of the pit, the on my deathbed, that I would remember or want to turn and reflect on God and remember God's goodness. But so often it does. I was just talking to a friend about this the other day. So often it's in the middle of our storms that we finally turn back to God. And that's what we see here with Jonah, and you also see that with the younger son in the parable of the prodigal son.
No, I love that. I have a feeling that in this chapter we're going to end up running across a lot of figurative language and word pictures that are going to help us grasp what Jonah was going through. I mean, you've already talked about it already, Sarah, this idea of Sheol, as well as just the picture that we get painted of him finally being in so much distress that he's willing to go to his father. But we also, I don't know if this is resonating with anyone else, but I can't help but read Jonah chapter 2 and hear the psalmists' voice in their poetic way of speaking that is so crying out to God. In my distress, I called to the Lord, and I heard you heard my cry for mercy. There's these anguish cries that we hear in the Psalms. And when I went and looked at my study Bible and looked at my cross references, funny enough, Jonah points to a lot of Psalms because a lot of the language he's using here in chapter 2 is very similar to the way the psalmists talk to God in their prayers and in their anguish, in their distress, when they were at wit's end, where did they want to turn to, and how did they think about who God really was? There's so many Psalms that I could point to, but I think it's worth us reading Psalm 139, verses 7 through 10, probably one of my most favorite Psalms of all time, just because we get such a good word picture of understanding who God is, and where he's at in our lives, a personal relationship. I want to read it for us. I want you to listen to these verses, and you can almost hear Jonah. If you've read chapter 2, you can hear Jonah almost saying something very similar. This is what it says. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there, your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. Man, it just sounds so much like Jonah in the way that he would be talking, because he tried to flee. He tried to escape, and yet God was always there pursuing him every step of the way. Even as Jonah ran from the Lord and he disobeyed God, God's pursuing Jonah all the time. And I think we can all relate. There's been times where we've tried to run away from God and yet and try to avoid his presence. And yet I'm so thankful for Psalms like this that are so encouraging, and stories like Jonah that remind us God's not separating himself from us. We're the ones that are oftentimes running away from him. We cannot flee from his presence. And this language just oozes in chapter 2. This is why I love this chapter so much, because it is so beautifully reflective of oftentimes our own relationship with God.
For sure, for sure. No, I that you cannot flee God's presence,
No.
right? And there's maybe times when that might be bad news, and times when that is really, really good news.
Yeah.
Like when you're at death's door,
Right,
and the
absolutely.
belly of the fish, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So I want to pick back up in verse 3. And as I read verse 3, I noticed something that Jonah was doing here. And Jonah, not only is he recognizing that, after the fact, really, I can't flee God's presence, but he's realizing and he's seeing God's hand in the events that are taking place, even now in the moment. And he says in verse 3, and listen for this, who, and the question I have here is, notice who Jonah is recognizing, who's really behind what is happening here. Okay, so in verse 3 it says, "You threw me into the depths, into the heart of the seas, and the currents overcame me. All your breakers and your billows swept over me." You threw me and all your breakers and your waves, right? Like Jonah is recognizing, although technically, if you read chapter 1, it was the sailors who threw Jonah overboard.
Yes, technically.
But Jonah is recognizing this is actually God's hand, and God really disciplining him here. But it's not just that. He doesn't just recognizing God's hand in disciplining and bringing him back around. He also sees God's provision too. If we were to jump back up to chapter 1, verse 17, the very, very last verse in chapter 1, it says, "The Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." And so that again was the CSB translation, "The Lord appointed a great fish." Well, in different translations, the NIV says the Lord provided, and the New Living Translation says the Lord arranged. So Jonah is clearly seeing here that God was the one that provided this. He saved him, right? That God provided a way for him to be saved and to turn back to him. So he's just, as you really do, as you read the entire book of Jonah, you see God's hand so evidently just throughout the book. He is the real hero of the story here. But there's a couple things I just wanted to shout out so that we can make sure we see here early on in Jonah chapter 2.
No, and I'm going to actually pile onto that, because not only do we see God's hand in the book of Jonah, but we actually see God's hand in events that are apparent throughout the entire Bible. In fact, Jonah's story is actually mentioned in the New Testament. Talking about God's provision in some ways. You actually can find this finding through your cross references. Apparently, this is Heather's favorite thing today, or every day. But if
Every day.
every day. But if you look at your cross references, it will point you to Matthew 12 in verses 38 through 41. But specifically verse 40, this is what Jesus says. He says, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." there was provision for Jonah. There was sovereignty. God, sovereignty is just a fancy word of saying God knew what was going to happen. He was there, and he understood the path and the plan of what was going to happen, not only for Jonah, but also for the reason why Jesus came and died and was resurrected 3 days later. And so I love seeing God's hand in every aspect of the biblical story. But what's also fascinating about these 3 days and 3 nights and the fact that Jesus brings this up in Matthew is there's some significance to 3 days and 3 nights. And I think we oftentimes would overlook it because in America, this isn't something that we think about very often, or in a Western world. But in the culture back then, it was quite significant, this 3 days, 3 nights, because according to Jewish tradition, a soul would hover over the body for 3 days. And meaning that a person wasn't considered fully dead until 3 days after being in the grave, which makes these 3 days not only significant for Jesus and his death, which is phenomenal. I mean, just already mind blown when you think about his death and resurrection happening after 3 days. But on top of it, we see Jonah, in a sense, dying to his self inside the belly of a fish after 3 days. And so there's this significant tie as we look at this concept of 3 days and 3 nights that brings so much more possibility and understanding of the power of who God is. God can do impossible things, bring people back from the dead, and he can do it both spiritually, he can do it physically. And I just love that nod that Jesus gives to Jonah's story. Not only does it help us with the reliability of Jonah's story, but it also is a phenomenal nod to a big God who does impossible things.
I love that shout out to Jonah dying to self here in this chapter. And you really do see that. So let's go ahead and start to apply this to our lives here. And there's 2 angles as we go to apply chapter 2 that I want to look at. One is, what do we learn from Jonah? And the second one is, what do we learn about God? We ask that question a lot, really just about every day. It's a good one.
Yeah, we do ask it almost every day in every passage we read.
Right. So the first one being, what do we learn about Jonah? That is, and I just want to give a quick shout out to when you're reading a book in the Bible that is narrative, that is story, one of our favorite go-to questions is, what can you learn from the actions and the mistakes of the biblical characters in the story? Because they're not perfect. And we've already seen this. Jonah is not perfect, but what can we learn from the actions and mistakes that we see from him here in chapter 2? Because he's actually progressed. He's been learning along in here. So again, at the time that he wrote this, it was a prayer in need. But at the very end of chapter 2, he's writing this, he's recounting this prayer later, obviously. He didn't have a pencil and paper. Well, I guess it would have been
in
paper.
the belly of the fish.
In the belly of the fish. So as he recounts this prayer later, it becomes a prayer or like a poetry, of thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And so I want to read real quick verses 8 and 9. And it says, "Those who cherish worthless idols abandon their faithful love. But as for me, I will sacrifice to you with a voice of thanksgiving. I will fulfill what I have vowed. Salvation belongs to the Lord." So I think it's interesting here because I think Jonah is saying, hey, it is pointless to worship these worthless idols. That's what worthless idols is, what my translation says here. And I think after you see God's hand so clearly, it is completely worthless. And Jonah knows that. And so what's also interesting is that Jonah's loyalty, even though he was disobedient in chapter 1, his loyalty to God didn't really ever waver. Even in chapter 1, verse 9, when he was asked by the sailors, really, who are you and where do you come from? He says, I am a Hebrew. I worship the Lord. He still considered himself very, very loyal to God, even though he was being disobedient and not listening to God, which is a little bit of a, whoa, how often might I do the same thing? Oh no, I'm loyal to you, God, but I'm going to ignore you right now.
Can I pause you for a second? Notice the order in which he says those. I am a Hebrew and I worship God. Already, even in that sentence, he's actually saying his nationality was more important than God. So, there is still a little bit of Jonah that is reflecting, he doesn't necessarily even in that moment say, I'm putting God first. I find that fascinating.
It is.
He was struggling through this concept of worshiping other things over God throughout his entire journey here.
I love that you call that out, because Jonah really was a patriot, right? And along with that he had a lot of pride.
Yeah.
A lot of pride in who he was. He was a Hebrew. He worshiped God, and he's very, very loyal to that identity and to
Yes.
who he was. And what's interesting is you talk about that dying to self, and you start to see that here at the end, is that he is turning back to God. He's becoming more repentant and dying to that, a little bit of that pride that we see. And at the very, very end here, it says he's renewing a commitment with a vow to the Lord.
You know what I find fascinating about this is how often, I mean, yes, we're learning from his mistakes and his actions. I'm just reflecting on my own personal life. How often am I putting God as number one? Am I putting him as the top card? Or how often does my pride get in the way, or my desire for other things to be more important than God? There's so much that we can learn from Jonah's mistakes, to be honest. I don't know, he hasn't really had any winning moments here yet that I'm at least seeing. But what it shines a light on is my own heart and my own mistakes that I have made as well, where I haven't put God as my ultimate thing that I really trust, honor, respect, put as first. I've heard it talked about as the top card. If you have a deck of 52 cards, what's your top card? And God should be your top card. You're gonna have 52 things in your life that are gonna be priority, but what is the thing that is the most important? And Jonah, even in the way he talks, he was struggling to put God as top. There were so many other things, but he in the belly, he finally is getting to a spot where he's starting to realize, oh shoot, you should have been on top. You should have been number one, and I haven't put you there.
And it makes me think of how often it does take for us, like the prodigal son, like Jonah, to hit rock bottom.
Truly.
Before we cry out to God.
Yeah.
But also, often as we look back on those moments in our life, we tend to, or I hope,
Yes.
I hope that we can see God's hand, even if at the moment we were angry with God, even if in the moment we were refusing to listen, or really just not placing God in our top card. And a lot of that is we're distracted, we're comfortable. There's a lot of reasons.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. But it is so often in those moments where we've hit rock bottom, that we finally cry out to God.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate that it takes that, but sometimes it does. I usually my prayers, these are unconventional prayers, folks, but oftentimes I am like, Lord, hit me over the head with a frying pan. Like I sometimes feel like I'm missing it unless you are super clear. And oftentimes it's in the moments of distress that it's so crystal clear. And it's like, oh, it's not that you weren't helping me, Lord, figure out what you wanted. It was me not wanting to listen and just fleeing away from you.
Okay, I love that you actually said that, because I've heard Heather say this before. Lord, hit me over the head with a frying pan.
I say it often.
Well, Jonah kind of got the frying pan.
He did.
It was in the form of a fish.
It was.
Make your will clear. I already did. And I will remind you, here is,
Totally.
Let's bring you back and tell you again what we're going to be doing now, which is where we're going to pick back up in chapter 3.
Yeah.
But I wanted to apply two things. One, what do you learn from Jonah? And quite a bit. I think we learned quite a bit. Also, what do you learn about God? I think this is actually a great thing to reflect on here, and kind of pointing back to that Psalm 139. God's always there. He's always there for us. Even when we screw things up, even when we run the other direction, God is here to bring us back. Not only is he a provider, as we see with even God providing the fish, but also that he wants to bring us back. He wants to bring us back into being in relationship with him. And I find that really, really sweet and very kind that he will do that as we are meandering and running in the opposite direction.
As you go to read Jonah 2, what I think is so beautiful is you have these moments where Jonah identifies the nature of who God is. When he talks about, in distress, he answered me. The Lord answered me. And then it goes on to say, and you listened to my cry. I think oftentimes when we are in our tough moments, I love that Jonah finally is getting to a spot where he's praying in response to this tough moment. Number one, are we doing that? Are we praying and reaching out to God? And are we believing that he actually is on the other end listening and wanting to help? I think oftentimes we can just think that he's standing there with his arms crossed and kind of just giving us this stern look. Depending on your relationship with your earthly father, oftentimes the way we picture God can be reflective of a parent being disappointed or being frustrated. And I think that we have to remember the character of God, of how we learn of who he is from the Bible, not from who's been reflecting a father figure in our own lives, because I think we forget that he is a God of mercy mercy. He's a God of justice. He's a God of love, and he's a God who pursues us, and he listens and he answers. And Jonah's prayer is full of this beautiful language that just evokes this loving father who just wants to have a relationship with his children. And I just find that so comforting. Even in the depths of the fish, Jonah still, he sees this. I hope that in our own figurative belly of the fish, we can see that same God that is so big and so worthy of praise.
Absolutely. Well said. Jonah chapter 2 has been fun to study.
Oh, I love it.
It was at first a little bit difficult to maybe wrap our head around, or, poetry kind of can be.
I kind of feels like genealogies to me sometimes, where you're like, what am I supposed to do with all of this? Like, what, where am I supposed to go with it? But there's a lot in here.
Yeah. And I think that the final two apply questions are really, gosh, what do we learn from Jonah, and what he's come through, and what do we learn about God? And we're kind of good overall questions to look at.
I think so.
Jonah chapter 2 with. If you are interested in studying more about Jonah, again, go to our website and you can download our Bible study that will walk you through each chapter with questions to ask along the way. And if you are interested in studying the Bible and want to learn and build confidence in studying the Bible, again, visit our website there's a lot more resources and articles there along the way. Also, our podcast here, continue to listen to this. That is our goal, is to help you build confidence in studying the Bible. We thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next time.